I don't like Nazi comparisons. I just generally don't. And there's been a lot of them that have been high profile. I don't care if they're coming from the left or from the right. I just don't like Nazi comparisons because they're very lazy. The Hitler comparisons, I just feel like it's a cheap way for people to make their point about something. I mean, how many times has Trump supporters been called Nazis? I mean, I've been called a Nazi a million times on social media. I just think they're lazy. So generally speaking, I don't like them. But there was a brand new Seattle Times columnist who got fired from his job after just 2 months, after his very first op-ed, in part because of a Hitler-Nazi comparison that he made. And he's telling his story today in the Free Press, which is the independent news source from Barry Weiss. Highly recommend you read the article. And I want to go through the sequence of events and we'll read his story from his perspective. The story, again, in the Free Press is headlined, "My family was hunted by Nazis, but I was fired for defending Hitler." It was written by David Volodsko, who again was had a very brief stint as an op-ed writer for the Seattle Times. In the article he writes, "I was just fired from my job at the Seattle Times after defending Hitler. The only problem is I never defended Hitler," and I'll read from it here. "In fact, my family was hunted by the Nazis. My grandfather was a Nazi killer who later almost died in a concentration camp, and some of my best journalistic work has been exposing neo-Nazi lies. But if you want to hear a story about the intolerance in our country's, quote, most tolerant city and the erosion of civil discourse in American life, read on." Well, yes, sir, I do want to hear a story about intolerance in our country's most tolerant city and the erosion of civil discourse in American life. So I did read on. But to set this all up, so again, David was a brand new, opinion writer for the Seattle Times. And he says in this story that he wanted to write about something else entirely. And he ends up being told to or assigned to write an article about the infamous Lenin statue that's in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood. So it's a long background of how it got there, but essentially in the heart of the Fremont neighborhood, there is this giant statue of the Russian communist murderous dictator Vladimir Lenin. And every so often, the issue of this statue comes up about, why is it here? Should we let it stay here? Should we take it down? What should we do with it? So he ends up writing his first op-ed for the Times. The headline, "Dear Fremont, we need to talk about Lenin and your statue of the genocidal tyrant." And he doesn't argue in the article that it should be removed or make any opinion about what its, ultimate fate should be. But the takeaway of the article is, look, people go and they see this statue and they'll paint its hands red and they'll dress it up on the holidays, put a pumpkin on its head and stuff. He said, maybe we should reconsider how we treat this statue and instead of sort of making a joke out of it or making a spectacle out of it, considering Lenin killed millions and millions of people. So he writes this article. And as with any opinion piece, it gets mixed reviews. Some people like it, some people don't. But then he takes to Twitter to talk about it a little further. And it seems that this is where his mistake was. And it was on Twitter where he started to draw comparisons between Hitler and Lenin. So he tweets out in part, "In fact, while Hitler has become the great symbol of evil in history books, he too was less evil than Lenin because Hitler only targeted people he personally believed were harmful to society, whereas Lenin targeted even those he himself did not believe were harmful in any way." So there are some activists on Twitter who just lost it over that, absolutely lost it, and started, tweeting at the Times about this writer and, hey, he's trying to downplay what Hitler did, comparing him to Lenin, whatever, the usual stuff. So in this article, again, published this morning in the Free Press, David explains what he was intending to do with that comparison on Twitter. He writes, "I was only speaking in terms of intention, of who wanted to kill more, not who actually did. And in a follow-up tweet, I explained, quote, Hitler was more evil than Lenin if we're looking at what they did to people. And that's a pretty important metric for assessing evil." So he goes on to say, "6 days after my piece was published, I was relieved when my boss told me she had reviewed the Twitter conversation and concluded I had obviously not defended Hitler," because that's what all the activists on Twitter were saying. All the far-left bloggers who just hate the Times op-ed board anyway. He goes on to say, "I was told the company had my back. I was told the paper would not stand for a lying Twitter mob coming after one of its own." Okay, and that sounds pretty promising. Like, great. Seattle Times is going to stand by this guy whose family was literally hunted by the Nazis and say, no, we're not going to buy into these nonsensical accusations that he's now defending the very people who hunted down and killed his family. So, and then he gives the caveat. So he's told, again, 6 days after the piece published, he's going to keep his job, family's going to have his back, they're not going to bend to a Twitter mob. Except, he says, just a few hours later, my boss called me and told me I was fired. The official reason for firing me was, quote, poor judgment and, quote, continuing to engage online. They said I shouldn't have engaged. He says, I admit it was hard not to defend my family against the baseless accusations they were Nazis who had killed more than 10,000 Jews. So here you've got this writer, brand new to Seattle, is assigned to do an op-ed on something he doesn't even want to do an op-ed on, the Lenin statue in Fremont. Someone whose family was hunted by the Nazis. He makes the mistake on Twitter of doing a Hitler comparison, doing a Nazi comparison, comparing one genocidal maniac to another. People come after him, and the Seattle Times bends to the mob, as so many media outlets do. So the Times released a statement about this saying, a Seattle Times editorial writer engaged in Twitter recently in a way that is inconsistent with our company's values and those of our family ownership. Effective immediately, he is no longer employed by the Seattle Times. While we passionately believe in creating lively discourse through a variety of viewpoints, we do so with respect and appreciation for all communities. We apologize for any pain we have caused our readers, our employees, and the community. So basically, it sounds like the family that owns the Times is like, no, you got to fire him. And that's the danger, right, of not being an independent journalist, is you can be fired at the whim of the people that you work for reasons that are ridiculous. So again, to sum up the absurdity of this, 2 months on the job, first op-ed, an assignment he was given. This guy ends up being painted as like pro-Hitler, even though his family was hunted by the Nazis. The Seattle Times promises to stand behind him, says they're not going to bend to a lying Twitter mob. And then what do they do a few hours later? They bend to a lying Twitter mob. And one of the things I think that made me feel most bad for this writer is he was talking about how he was excited to live and work in Seattle. How, he brought his family here, and there's so many aspects to this supposedly inclusive, tolerant city that he really was looking forward to. And he writes in the piece, the job was rewarding. From the first day, I found myself reporting on the protection of orcas and efforts to improve the level of civil discourse in Congress. When Pride Month came, my family proudly marched with the Seattle Times. What a beautiful new home, I thought to myself. How inclusive, how tolerant, how naive. How naive indeed. Again, I encourage that you read that full article at the Free Press, but I think it is so indicative of this point that we've come to where, and I'll use again Nazi comparisons as an example. You know how many far left bloggers in Seattle, like Erica Barnett, who have compared Trump supporters to Nazis? I remember a tweet in particular where she was talking about, all the Nazis that attended a speech of former President Donald Trump's. And essentially, again, you're talking about a homicidal dictator and his army that killed millions of innocent people. And it's okay for far left bloggers to compare a president, a modern day president, and his supporters to Nazis, to Hitler. But it's not okay for a Seattle Times columnist whose family was hunted down by the Nazis to talk about Lenin and Hitler and the comparisons and contrasts between the two of them, because we live in a society right now where there's absolutely no room for nuance, number one, because there was a lot of nuance in the argument that this writer was making. But we also live in a society where the left, the far left, as far as the media is concerned, can get away with a lot more. Can absolutely get away with a lot more. If you're comparing someone who's on the right to Nazis, then that's just, that's great. No big deal. And it's this double standard. But it all, I think, just speaks to the erosion of our ability to have a reasonable conversation. And I couldn't help but kind of laugh at, around the same time, another columnist who posted in the Seattle Times did this piece kind of waxing poetically about the downfall of journalism. And in the piece, he talks about how, trust for journalism and corporate media is at an all-time low. And it doesn't have to be this way. And first of all, I just reject the narrative that we're all, letting the media die and that's a danger to democracy. The media is slowly killing itself. And an example is what we just talked about with them firing a columnist for the crime of, not framing a tweet very well. So anyway, in this Other Times op-ed by Marcus Harrison Green, the headline is, "If we let journalism die, our democracy won't be too far behind." And in it he writes, "I'm not Pollyannish about our media. I know that it can be used for malevolent intent, but too often is. But God, I also know its force as a tool to level our society's power differentials, to remind each other that we are not alone and that what we do, how we act, and how we conduct our lives in the shared act of living matters. That these problems of complexity we face, whether racial, environmental, political, or economical, will not be solved by simplistic reactions, but by meaningful responses." So I would ask the Seattle Times, which again published that op-ed, are you following that yourselves? When Marcus Harrison Green says these problems of complexity we face, whether racial, environmental, political, or economical, will not be solved by simplistic reactions, but by meaningful responses? I would ask the Seattle Times, was your response to the controversy around your brand new columnist, was it a meaningful response? Or was it a simplistic reaction? Was it a simplistic reaction that was based on what the easiest thing to do in the moment would be to silence the mob? I would argue that it was a very simplistic reaction, that it was not a meaningful response. And that in doing so, you undercut exactly what this column is trying to argue about the best path forward as a country and the best path forward for journalism in this country. Something to think about for the Seattle Times, and I think an awful good starting place would be to apologize to the columnist that you fired for overreacting, for bending to a Twitter mob, and offer him his job back if he wants to take it.